Seattle's rain had a way of turning memories into ghosts. On that gray evening, the sky seemed to mourn with Daniel Reeves as he sat behind the wheel of his car, the steady rhythm of the wipers failing to clear the blur in front of him. The road was slick, glistening under the glow of streetlights that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, and the hum of the engine was the only sound steady enough to match the ache in his chest. He had just left the memorial service, 2 years too late for most people's understanding. But grief did not follow calendars. It waited. It lingered. And for Daniel, it had waited until guilt became unbearable, until he could no longer silence the voice that whispered every night that he should have been there when she needed him most. The service had been small, quiet, attended by a few friends who had long run out of things to say that could comfort him. The cemetery groundskeeper had patted his shoulder gently and murmured, "Most folks come sooner," but Daniel had no answer to that. How could he explain that the act of saying goodbye felt like betrayal? That letting go meant admitting she was never coming back. The car's heater hummed softly, fogging the windows, and he turned up the radio, only to be greeted by the soft tune of a song Sarah used to hum while making breakfast. He turned it off instantly, his chest tightening as the sound of silence pressed against his ears. That he drove without purpose, the rain creating a curtain between him and the rest of the world. It was supposed to be just another drive to clear his mind, a habit he'd picked up after she died. He didn't expect to find anyone else out there, especially not in that weather. But life had a cruel way of colliding strangers at the exact moment they needed each other most. At first, he thought it was his imagination, just a shadow near the bus stop, blurred by the storm. But as his headlights caught her, he saw a young woman huddled under the broken shelter, her body curved protectively around a small child who was shaking from the cold. She had no umbrella, no coat thick enough for the rain, just trembling arms that shielded the little one as best she could. The sight pierced something deep inside Daniel, something he thought had died with Sarah, the instinct to protect. He slowed the car, the tires hissing against the wet pavement, and before he even knew why, he was pulling over. He rolled down the window, and rain instantly poured onto his sleeve. "Need a ride?" he called out, raising his voice above the storm. The woman looked up, startled, her eyes wide and uncertain. They were the kind of eyes that carried too much sorrow for someone so young, eyes that had seen disappointment and kept going anyway. "The bus was cancelled," she said softly, her voice almost lost to the thunder. "I don't need money. She's sick, and her grandmother's waiting. The clinic's closed." In the back seat, Daniel's 9-year-old son, Ethan, pressed his small hands against the fogged window, his eyes big and worried. "Dad, she's freezing," he said. "Mom always said we should help people who help other people." The simplicity of his words left no room for hesitation. Daniel unlocked the doors, the woman thanked him quietly and climbed in, her wet clothes dripping onto the seat as she held the small child close. The little girl was pale, her breathing shallow, her skin flushed with fever. Daniel handed back a blanket from the trunk while Ethan offered his bottle of water, and for a moment, the car filled with the sound of soft breathing, the hum of the heater, and the distant rhythm of rain. The woman introduced herself as Emma. Her voice trembled not from fear, but exhaustion. She whispered to the child, soothing her gently, and then reached into her pocket for a crumpled piece of paper. With careful precision, she began folding it into a crane. Her fingers moved quickly, instinctively, as though they'd done this hundreds of times before. When the paper bird was finished, she placed it into the little girl's hand. "My mom taught me this," she murmured. "When you fold one for someone who's hurting, you give them a piece of hope to hold on to." Ethan watched in awe as the girl's breathing began to calm, her small hand clutching the paper crane tightly. It was a small miracle in the middle of a storm. Daniel caught Emma's reflection in the rearview mirror, her hair plastered to her face, her expression calm but weary, like someone who'd carried too many storms of her own. The rest of the drive was quiet. The city lights shimmered through the rain, distorted and beautiful, as if reflected in tears. When they reached the small apartment complex on the edge of town, Emma insisted on carrying the child herself. Daniel and Ethan watched through the fogged glass as she handed the girl to an elderly woman waiting at the door. The grandmother's face crumpled with gratitude. She pressed money into Emma's hand, but Emma shook her head and smiled softly, refusing to take it. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. Something about that small act, refusing payment for kindness, unraveled him. He remembered Sarah, how she used to stay late at the hospital to sit with patients who had no visitors, how she'd come home exhausted but still smiling. The resemblance was haunting. When Emma turned back toward his car, rain dripping from her hair, she smiled faintly and said, "Thank you for stopping." Then she disappeared into the shadows, leaving Daniel sitting there with his son, wondering why his chest felt both heavier and lighter all at once. Driving home, Ethan was unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the window where raindrops chased each other down the glass. "Dad," he said softly, "Mom would have liked her." Daniel didn't answer, but his hand tightened on the steering wheel. Maybe it was the kindness, or the way Emma had shielded the child without hesitation, but something about her had stirred a part of him he thought was gone. That night, as the rain continued to fall, Daniel lay awake listening to the sound of it against the roof. His house felt emptier than ever, but somewhere deep down, a new thought took root, small and uncertain, but alive. Maybe this encounter wasn't random. Maybe, after 2 years of guilt and silence, the universe was finally giving him a second chance to do what he couldn't before, to save someone. But he didn't know then that this woman, the stranger he'd helped in the storm, was not only someone who needed saving herself but someone whose life was tied to his in ways he could never have imagined. He couldn't know that she had already crossed paths with the person he loved most in the world, long before that night. But for the first time in years, Daniel Reeves fell asleep with something that felt almost like hope flickering quietly in his heart. Monday morning dawned gray and indifferent, the way most Seattle mornings did. The storm from that night had passed, leaving behind streets slick with reflection and a heaviness that hung in the air like breath after crying. Daniel Reeves sat in his office, staring at numbers on a screen that refused to make sense. His company, Revitech Systems, was thriving, the reports all screamed success, rising profits, new contracts, stable investors, yet he felt nothing. The silence of his office was the kind that echoed, the kind filled not with peace, but with ghosts. The events of the other night still lingered in his mind, the woman in the rain, the child coughing in her arms, the paper crane folded with such quiet grace that it had seemed like magic. He told himself it was just a moment of kindness, that she was probably fine, that their paths had crossed and would never cross again. But fate, he was beginning to learn, had its own sense of timing. The intercom on his desk buzzed, sharp and intrusive. His assistant's voice cracked slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Reeves, you need to take this call. It's from Maple Grove Elementary, it's about your son." The words sliced through the air. Daniel's chair screeched against the floor as he stood, heart hammering. He barely heard the rest, something about Ethan collapsing in class, an ambulance not being needed, a request that he come immediately. The drive to the school blurred into instinct, his body moving faster than his thoughts. Every red light felt personal. Every slow driver a threat. He'd already lost one person he loved. He couldn't bear to lose another. When he burst through the doors of the nurse's office, chest heaving, he was met not by chaos but by an unexpected calm. Ethan sat on the edge of the examination table, pale but breathing normally, a juice box in his hand. And beside him, checking his pulse with quiet focus, was a familiar face. Emma. Gone were the rain-soaked clothes and the trembling desperation. She wore scrubs now, light blue, slightly faded, and her hair was tied back neatly. The same gentleness he'd seen in her eyes that night was still there, steady and unassuming. "You," he said, the word escaping before he could think. She glanced up, startled, recognition flashing across her features. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, her professional tone steady, but her eyes uncertain. "Your son's okay." It was a fainting spell. Probably dehydration, maybe skipped breakfast. Ethan smiled weakly. "She gave me juice and checked my heartbeat. Said I just need rest." Daniel exhaled, his body trembling with the release of fear. "You're a nurse." "I used to be permanent staff," she replied, her tone turning careful. "Now I work through an agency. Mostly fill-ins at schools, clinics, hospitals that can't afford full-time nurses anymore." She turned back to Ethan, checking his temperature with gentle efficiency. "He said he's been having trouble sleeping. Nightmares." "That's normal after," she hesitated, her eyes flicking to Daniel, "after a loss." The words hit harder than she probably intended. Daniel swallowed, guilt settling heavy in his chest. He'd been so consumed by his own grief that he hadn't noticed how deeply Ethan was struggling. "He doesn't talk about her much," he said quietly. "Sometimes they don't," Emma replied, not looking up. "Sometimes they just need someone to listen without asking them to explain." Her words stayed with him long after they left the school. That night, while putting Ethan to bed, Daniel noticed his son clutching something small in his palm. It was a paper crane. The same kind Emma had folded for the sick child in the rain. Ethan smiled sleepily when he caught his father looking. "She made me this," he murmured. "Said it's for brave hearts." Daniel said nothing, but his throat tightened. The next day, as the rain returned, he found himself standing at Emma's apartment door. He didn't know what compelled him, maybe gratitude, maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper he wasn't ready to name. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. Behind her, he saw the modest room of someone barely holding life together, a stack of nursing journals, origami cranes hanging like prayers from the ceiling, a small framed photo of a woman who looked enough like her to be her mother. "I'm sorry to drop by," he began awkwardly. "But I wanted to thank you. For helping Ethan. And, for the other night." She smiled faintly but didn't step aside. "You don't need to thank me. You would have done the same." "Maybe," he said, hesitating. "But I need help. My nanny quit last week. Ethan needs someone while I'm at work. Just temporary, 2 weeks." She looked startled, her fingers tightening on the edge of the door. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you should know about me." He waited, curiosity deepening, but she didn't continue. "Everyone has something," he said finally. "I'm just asking for 2 weeks." Inside, as she considered, her gaze drifted to a small glass jar on her kitchen table filled with paper cranes. She had made them during sleepless nights, folding her guilt into delicate wings. She wanted to tell him no, to keep her distance, but the memory of Ethan's laugh, rare and unguarded, echoed in her mind. Against her better judgment, she nodded. 2 weeks, she said softly. The first days were uneasy. Daniel's house, though large and beautifully designed, felt suffocating. The walls seemed to absorb grief, the silence swallowing every sound. Ethan, though polite, was withdrawn, a shadow of the boy he had been before his mother's death. Meals were eaten in near silence, the clink of silverware the only sound between them. Emma moved quietly, doing her best to stay invisible, but healing often starts in small, unremarkable moments. One evening, when the silence grew unbearable, Emma rose from the table and walked to the piano in the corner, untouched since Sarah's passing. Dust covered the keys like time frozen in place. She sat, hesitating, then began to play. The melody was simple, tender, a song of morning light and soft beginnings. Ethan's head lifted. "Do you know Morning Sky?" he asked. "Mom used to sing it." Emma's hands faltered for a second, then continued. "Yes," she said quietly. "My mother used to hum it when I was little." Her voice was almost a whisper, but it filled the house like sunlight through clouds. Daniel froze, his heart stuttering. That song had been Sarah's lullaby. The one she sang to Ethan every night before she died. Hearing it again was both agony and relief, like being reminded of something you thought you'd lost forever. When the final note faded, the silence felt different, softer, almost peaceful. Ethan smiled, small but real. "Can you teach me?" he asked, and just like that, something fragile began to shift. Over the next days, laughter returned in small doses. Paper cranes began to appear on windowsills and shelves. Emma taught Ethan to fold them, explaining that each one carried a wish for healing. Daniel began to join them at dinner, setting his phone aside, listening to Ethan's stories. The house, once a monument to grief, slowly began to breathe again. Emma still moved with a quiet sadness, though. Sometimes Daniel would find her staring out the window, her hands trembling, her eyes distant, as if haunted by a memory too heavy to share. There was something unspoken in her presence, gratitude, maybe, or guilt. Daniel didn't press. For the first time in years, life felt less like survival and more like living. The quiet that had once comforted Daniel Reeves now carried weight. It wasn't the hollow, grieving silence that had haunted his penthouse for months, but a kind of waiting silence, the calm before something inevitable and irreversible. The 2 weeks Emma had promised had stretched into 4, then 6. Each day bled into the next, and though neither spoke of it, both knew something fragile had been built between them, something that wasn't supposed to exist but had taken root all the same. Ethan adored her. The boy who had once gone to bed in silence now laughed before dinner, told stories, and filled the house with small noises that sounded like life returning. Emma had become part of their rhythm, her soft voice in the mornings, her laughter in the kitchen, her quiet humming that carried through the halls like a memory of warmth. Yet beneath that gentle surface, shadows were gathering. Daniel had noticed the tension behind Emma's eyes, the way she sometimes froze when his phone rang, or how she avoided the topic of her past with careful precision. He didn't push her, not yet. He told himself he respected her privacy, but the truth was, he was afraid. Afraid that knowing too much would undo the fragile peace they'd found. Still, something about her didn't add up. Her nursing license had expired 2 years earlier. Her last listed address didn't match where she said she lived. And there were moments when she seemed to look at him with an ache that made no sense, like someone carrying a secret too heavy to keep but too dangerous to share. It all began to unravel one rainy Thursday. Daniel was at his office reviewing a new acquisition proposal when his assistant entered, pale-faced, holding a file. "You asked me to do a background check on Ms. Emma Taylor," she said hesitantly. "I think you need to see this." The folder landed on his desk with a dull thud. Inside were records, hospital incident reports, an old nursing suspension notice, and a name he hadn't expected to see. Olivia Taylor. Emma's sister. The name tugged at a memory he couldn't place until he saw the date. April 12th. The same night his wife, Sarah, had died in the emergency room after the accident. His chest went cold. The report stated that Olivia Taylor had been the attending triage nurse that night, suspended 2 weeks later pending investigation into negligence that resulted in delayed care. The patient's name listed in bold letters, Sarah Reeves. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. The office felt smaller, the walls closing in as the truth slammed into him. He read the line again and again, hoping it would change. But it didn't. Emma Taylor, the woman who had brought his son back to life, who had unknowingly found her way into his own guarded heart, was the sister of the nurse responsible for the death of his wife. His mind spun with disbelief, anger, and something darker, betrayal wrapped in grief. Had she known who he was from the beginning? Was all of this some twisted attempt at redemption? By the time he reached home that evening, his heart was burning with questions. Emma was in the kitchen with Ethan, helping him with homework, her hair tied up, a small smile curving her lips. It was such an ordinary scene, so heartbreakingly normal, that he almost turned around and left. But then Ethan looked up, beaming. "Dad. Emma helped me finish the song on the piano. Can I show you?" His voice was light, proud. Daniel's throat tightened. He forced a smile, nodding. "In a minute, bud. Can I talk to Emma first?" She looked at him, startled by the edge in his tone. When Ethan left the room, Daniel placed the folder on the counter. "You should have told me," he said, his voice low and hard. She froze, her face draining of color. "Told you what?" she whispered. "That your sister, Olivia Taylor, was the nurse who treated my wife the night she died. Or should I say, didn't treat her." The silence that followed was unbearable. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the folder but didn't open it. "You found out," she murmured. "I wanted to tell you, Daniel. I tried, so many times. But I knew if I did, you'd never let me near Ethan. You'd never let me help." "Help?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "You lied to me. You came into my home, my son's life, pretending to care while hiding the truth about the worst night of my life." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't move toward him. "I wasn't pretending. I didn't even know it was your wife until I saw her photo here weeks later. My sister, she made a mistake that night, yes, but she wasn't a monster. She was exhausted, overworked, covering a double shift because the hospital was short-staffed. She made one mistake, and she never recovered from it. She lost her license. She lost everything. She died 6 months later, Daniel, from an overdose. She couldn't live with what happened." The air between them thickened with grief, anger, and something too complicated to name. Daniel wanted to yell, to hate her, but he saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way her voice broke when she said her sister's name. She wasn't defending her, she was mourning her. "You should have stayed away," he said finally, the words falling like stones. "I tried," she whispered. "But that night, when I saw you in the hospital, when you carried that woman into the ER, I remembered my sister's face. You looked the same way she did afterward. Broken. And then, when I saw your son, I saw what that grief had done to him. I couldn't walk away, not when I knew I could help. Even if you hate me for it." He turned away, unable to look at her. "You don't get to fix this," he said coldly. "You don't get to make peace with your sister's guilt using my family." She nodded slowly, tears spilling freely now. "I know. But maybe Ethan deserves the peace we never got." She glanced toward the piano room, where faint notes of the lullaby echoed, the one his wife used to sing. "If you want me to leave, I will. But please, don't take that song away from him." That night, Daniel sat awake long after the house went silent. The anger remained, but beneath it, another truth stirred, one he couldn't ignore. Emma hadn't come into their lives to hurt them. She'd come because she carried her sister's ghosts as much as he carried his own. Both had been broken by the same tragedy, both searching for forgiveness in different forms. Days passed in uneasy silence. Emma packed her things quietly, leaving no trace except for the paper cranes she had folded with Ethan, hundreds of them, lining the shelves like fragile prayers. When Daniel found one on his desk, he unfolded it. Inside, written in her delicate handwriting, were the words, "For Sarah. For forgiveness. For life to begin again." He stared at the paper for a long time, feeling something shift deep inside. Maybe forgiveness wasn't something that came all at once. Maybe it began with understanding, with seeing that pain had many sides, that guilt could destroy or redeem, depending on how one faced it. When he went to wake Ethan the next morning, he found the boy sitting by the window, folding another crane. "It's for Emma," Ethan said quietly. "She said we should keep wishing, even when it hurts." Daniel smiled faintly, his throat tight. "Yeah," he murmured, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We should."